Good afternoon. We're ready to start. So let me welcome you all. As you can see, we have proceeding at the moment, but we are recording the session. So welcome to everybody that's going to see us later. And for the person who are new here, Ataya is our interdisciplinary seminar. It happens every week, every Thursday. And each session engaged with a selected academic paper. It's a space for connection in Yuma, at UCT, and also beyond. We generally invite the speaker or guests to engage with human central themes on being human, but also colonial and feminist methodologies. So you can find the Ataya program as well as other similar programs on our website at huma.uct.ac. We have a book launch. On Mondays. We have an African epistemology seminar and a doctoral seminar that on the Wednesday slot. It's almost the end of the year, but we'll have a few more sessions next week, and I'll let you know at the end of the session. So we're very happy today to have Professor Elena Moore presenting a paper entitled Family Care of Older Persons in Southern Africa, and it's available on the website. You can see it. So let me say a few words about our guest. Elena Moore is an assistant professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology at UCT. She's the author of several books, and among them, Generation, Gender, and Negotiating Customs in South Africa. She's the recipient of the Distinguished Teaching Award in 2021 at the University of Cape Town, and also something that we're very happy about is that you launched a new program on family care giving of other persons in Southern Africa, for which you received a fund from the Welcome Area Development Award. So we are very happy to celebrate you, and also today to welcome you to discuss a research paper that's also connected to this ongoing program. So welcome, you have the floor, and we'll be happy to discuss after your presentation.
Thanks, Dominique, and thanks everyone, Huma colleagues, for being here and taking the time out. There probably are other things to do, so I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Elena. As Dominique has already introduced me, in the sociology department at UCT. I've been working in the area of, personal relationships, intergenerational relationships of support, customary law for some years and some times. I do want to share with you kind of the origins of these papers and our current work and why it matters for the papers, but why it matters overall in how we're moving forward. So I'm sorry about the load shedding, but from the first slide, for example, you'll see, we're a new program. It's the family caregiving of older persons in Southern Africa. So if you move to slide 2, you'll see that it's a 5-year program and it includes 3 components, right? So this is a bit of a sales pitch. Sorry, apologies for that. But there is a research study, a research development component, and a public engagement component. Now, the research study is a longitudinal qualitative study of family caregiving of older persons in 4 Southern African countries: South Africa, Malawi, Namibia, and Botswana. And we have extensive public engagement program that's basically creating space for dialogue and public engagement at local levels, at regional, provincial, I should say, national, and then regional. And the third component is a research and development program that's there to support researchers and all members of the team who are working in this area, so that we strengthen collaborations, but actually just also relationships with each other. So who we are, the third slide, so apologies again for that, but we are a team of over 25 researchers from Botswana, Malawi, and there's more, from South Africa and Namibia. And as I said, we're working with a range of collaborators. Now, just to give you a sense, and also because if I am a bit suffering from brain fog, we were in Durban yesterday hosting one of our older persons community fora. So I was up and down in the one day. But a key part of our public engagement work is co-hosting what we're calling older persons fora with organizations at the community level. So currently we've hosted about 7, I should say. And again, this forum acts as a space for different actors at the community level to create that space so that people can talk and share their experiences. So it's older persons, the family caregivers of the older persons, who may also be older persons themselves, home-based carers, social workers, clinic nurses, ward counsellors if they attend, and maybe even members of DSD if they also attend, and others. So religious figures in the community and anyone else who has, some role in provision of care for older persons. And just to give you kind of a sense, on the slide there, you'll see some of our kind of notices about these fora, but also some of our write-ups about them. And our intention with that is to hear the experiences at a community level, so that we're working in very practical ways at the community to hear what resources are available, what aren't, what can be improved upon, but what government officials and bodies can be tapped into to improve that particular service. So whether it's service or whether it's a resource, or so that's on the one hand what it's doing, right? So it may be, well, we see that there's a lack of incontinence products at the local clinic for whatever reason. There's been a stall for the last 6 months in provision of such. Why is it happening? Our job is to investigate why that's happening. We go to the Western Province Healthcare, and we investigate. Could also be that there is information sharing happening at such fora. So caregivers are meeting each other for the first time. They don't know each other necessarily in that community. It's not a bounded, very tight community in a small area that everyone knows everyone. So it's also acting as a space where people can learn from each other about how you did this, how you did that, how did you get around these types of things. So knowledge sharing, both from caregivers and care receivers, and also sometimes resource sharing, which is really, in a sense, what's happening. And so we bring a lot of those sentiments, those experiences, and then to province, and explain to province what's happening in multiple sites across, let's say, Cape Town or the Western Cape, and in KZN. So that's the sense, and then we also bring that to national when relevant, So that's what we're doing there, in addition to several other activities. In terms of the study, we're working with caregivers and care receivers with families where the older person has a care need. And now we might think, well, how do we define that? And that is exactly what we're here today to just think about. What is a care need, for whom, when is it owed, who supports, etc. So through this kind of deep engagement with the family and multiple members in the family, we hear about the experiences, the challenges, the support available to both the older persons and also to the caregivers, who actually have probably fewer resources available to them. We focus on that kind of constellation of care, or landscape of care. Who are all the social actors, family members and others involved, and in which ways are they involved? We particularly look at the costs of care. You'll see, for obvious reasons, we're looking at how families manage. But in addition to just talking to families, we're looking at provincial budgets, we're looking at national budgets, we're looking to try and figure out why has there been a defunding of certain activities and not of others. And that has particular colonial implications and replications, which I'll come to shortly. Okay, so today we don't have to go into the nitty-gritties of this sample for today, but that's just to show, we're working across geographical location, deep rural areas, peri-urban and urban, both in KZN and in the Western Cape. Our intention is to potentially go to Gauteng, but we need more resources and support to do so. So that's where we're at the moment. Here in the next slide, so we're probably on, where are we? Slide 6, if you've lost your position. It's we're working with collaborators in terms of what we discovered about 6 or 7 years ago when we were doing work with families, is that everyone was working in silos, both in terms of scholars, policymakers, government officials, other researchers. You had the medical sciences, the health sciences over there. There was very little going on, or there was stuff going on sociologically, but it wasn't connected or brought together. So that's what we tried to do. And that's where the origins of these papers that have been circulated are, in what we developed called the Care of Older Persons Southern African Network, which is a GCRF-funded network that brought these various actors in the region together. And we did that with a particular purpose about, all of us only know a piece of the puzzle, and we'll only ever know a piece of the puzzle. And we all need to, as I'm sure everyone in this room is very familiar with, we need to work together to share our knowledge and to prioritize knowledges that haven't been prioritized. And in order to do that, we need to talk to each other at multiple levels across multiple kind of parts of this, if you want to call it a sector. So getting on to today's talk, I should say, is looking at two kind of papers. The one is the editorial introduction of the special issue, and the second is my particular paper that I wrote based on previous work, not necessarily work that we're doing right now. So that special issue is featured in the International Journal of Care and Caring, and it's based on, as I said, this collaborative work we were doing on care of older persons in South Africa, which we built up over several years. Now, the special issue is the building blocks of what we wanted to do. It began setting out to think about and review how care of older person is located in global policy frameworks with specific national histories, contexts that tend to be homogenized, and where experiences of care and expectations of care in the region also tend to be homogenized. Histories of colonialism and shapings of care infrastructures get erased or don't get foregrounded. So in the papers, we center that and we begin the process. It's a long process. You can't do it in one paper, and you definitely can't do it in one special issue. So we begin that process of questioning some of the dominant conceptual thinking and policy talk, at least, that is from the global north, but how it very much filters into what we're made to see and how we think about those things, which we have to try and not unsee and move away from. So what are some of those key concerns conceptually? And in the global, I said in the global context and increasingly in the regional context here in South Africa as well, there is this growing concern about the rising older population, I should say, in the region. The cost that this cohort or population will have in our social protection system, in our health system, in our families, in our broader society, to our economy, etc. And this is drawn from some of Vera Sanso's work as well, in thinking about how both demography and different disciplines are shaping how we understand aging, right? So in South Africa, for example, like other countries in the region, the population is set to double. So currently we have about 5.5 million persons classified as older persons who are over 60. We'll get to that, about age, we'll get there, and that's set to double in about just over 25 years. So currently it's 9% of our population. It will be up to 20% in 25 years. These calculations and these alarming population estimates create concerns for all about the possible financial and care burdens. Currently there's about 1 billion in South Africa, already being spent on older persons grant. Can South Africa afford to spend 2 billion? Won't even be 2 billion, it'll be more because it'll be inflation of 25 years, which I've no idea what that would be. But, can South Africa afford that? What will happen? Will we increase the age at which universal pensions kick in? What will we do? Now, the focus on cost and care burdens is actually quite alarming. It's very useful for drawing government departments' attention to the area of care of older persons, an area that got often neglected over the last many years and many decades, but for sometimes understandable reasons. There were other pressing concerns and other priorities. However, the ways in which it's now often being used at national either in policy texts or in discourse, centralized in some texts, is that it's tending to predict how these population dynamics are going to shape the trajectories of aging in this context. And we know that those ideas are being based on the trajectories of aging in the global north. And yet these kind of ways and the ways in which the global policy framework frames, again, what we're seeing and how we should be preparing for such a crisis is what we're trying to do in the special issue. We're trying to alert to the various traps that are there in our thinking and seeing of how people are aging, poorly or otherwise, in particular contexts. So what are the dominant discourse circulate? There's many, obviously. And I'm still on the same slide. And the global policy frameworks, what you've heard, decade of healthy aging, independent living, functional capacity, the intrinsic capacity to be independent. There's many phrases. We could spend all day probably going through them. We see the influence of these concepts and thinking about older persons. And these are all drawn on specific Eurocentric understandings, Western and Eurocentric kind of hegemonies of age, biology, frailty, independent living, as I said. Conceptualizations of care for older persons that focus on an intrinsic capacity for independence seem obviously misplaced. I mean, again, no one in this room would probably question that. In settings characterized by interdependence. So rather than falling into the trap, we in the special issue think about what is care in this context? What is frailty? What is functional capacity when so many persons in the region work until they can no longer work? Contribute in multiple ways, productively and reproductively in many ways, in complex networks of care, social economic contributions in various ways by older people continue long after their own unmet functional needs are objectively defined. And I'm guessing people in the room kind of see that and get a sense of that. So we consider what constitutes care when necessities. What is care? It's food, it's housing, it's land. It's not necessarily a technological device that can measure, X, Y, and Z every minute of the day. It can be that too. But there are certain ways of thinking about access to food, access to housing, access to land, to name just a few, that are critical to human functioning, if you want to use those words. And in attempting to uncover the meaning of care and its multiple dimensions, the articles do shed light on the ways in which drawing on local understandings, local languages, local vernaculars open up possibilities and these multi-dimensional meanings. There are 7 papers. I'm not going to go through all 7 papers here today, but I would advise you they are open access. We negotiated with the publisher. They're open access till the end of June or so. So do try and have a look at the different papers that cover different parts of the region. In drawing again on what Vera Sanso and others have argued, we should not characterize older people only by their functional limitations. Rather, as illustrated in the articles in the special issue, we need to understand the substantial contributions to labor, to care, to various economies that older people are making in very constrained circumstances, and are often, So that's what we need to do, right? And that's what we're hoping to do going forward. Now, in thinking about some of the commonalities across the region, and thinking particularly about the colonial histories of care. And again, this will be a longer conversation than what is possible in one slide and in 3 minutes. But common across the region, needless to say, is the racialized and gendered marginalization and unequal access to the economy, to services, to very distinct and separate colonial histories. So yes, there are commonalities. The colonial legacies across the region resulted in generations of people economically oppressed during their lives, unable to make provisions for their old age. You will see coming up in various publications, be it the conversation or otherwise, the opening up of the question of private pension markets across the continent. And you begin to question, what is this for? In other contexts, this is talking about, the kind of the neoliberal new markets for older age and stuff. But what we're seeing is that those histories and those practices of, be it labor migration for many decades, needless to say, as we know in this room, have shaped gendered and racialized practices of care, and also the care needs, not just who can do care, who is expected to care, how have norms been shaped, but also the care needs. If you're working, as an example, as a miner for 15 years, you'd be lucky to live to, I'm not say lucky, you'd be lucky to live to 70. Most people don't. So it's not necessarily about, it's about the labor exploitation in earlier periods of life that kind of shape the conditions of aging over time, as an example. So across the region, each country, needless to say, created unique care regimes during the colonial era, with some countries like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia introducing pension schemes or old age homes and various legislative protection as early as the beginning of the 20th century. Now, such protections were not accessible to the majority of older persons at the time, but they did create an infrastructure for the post-independent state to work with, and how they manage that transition is of equal importance to understand. So in the South African case, which we're more working on now at the moment, is we see how some of the colonial infrastructure, particularly for older persons in terms of residential care, dominate our budgets. They completely flood the budget in ways that we can again talk about at length. So understanding those national, institutional, cultural histories as determining factors in the conditions of aging allow us to ask different sets of questions. So it's not just how do we care for older persons, like what are the tools or the programs we can suddenly adopt and change everything. It's what are the conditions, both historically shaped and currently in operation, that lead to poor conditions of people aging, of all of us aging, and when we look to those, some of the issues and ideas are not just about having better access to technology that can measure your sugar levels, although that is obviously also important. So what's common across the region, despite the presence of state grants and cash transfers, is that family support, civil society, religious organizations are critical in providing support, practical and otherwise, to large numbers of people. And that is what we're seeing on the ground, and what I'm sure everyone here is more than familiar with. It's critical. So if we zone in then on the next slide, on slide 10, and if we think of this, is particularly in relation to the paper that I was writing, and in focusing in on South Africa, for example, when we consider the histories and we consider the localities, and look, zoning in South Africa, zoning in maybe particular urban aspects of South Africa or rural aspects, we got to say what is happening in this particular site that has been shaped by the past, but how is the current context of this family, household, and community shaping particularly the inequalities around care, the care needs, the caregiving needs, and the inequalities from this house to the next house to the next house to the next community to the next city or whatever place. And so there are some features of current family life that's happening in South Africa that we need to get our heads around. And there are several, needless to say. We all know that families have been multi-generational forever. Whether they're living in the same household or not in the same household, families are wider sets of kin. They're not, two up, two down type scenarios. There's also kind of changes in how we think about whether they're women-headed, female-headed, or what's now called female-dominated. So, statistical evidence tells us today that in a particular household, about 50% of households in South Africa have an adult of one gender only. So they've become now female-dominated or male-dominant households, what they're classified as. What we see in those figures is that female-dominated households are far larger. They're more likely to include children and older persons and people living with disabilities. So here we get to see that if we are thinking about family care of older persons, it's not happening in isolation of other multiple care contexts that occur in the house, or in the household, never mind on the street, on the community, and beyond. In addition to that, we see how grants, social grants, many households in South Africa exclusively rely on social grants. We know this. It's heavily redistributed. Grants are targeted at individuals. They go to a person in the family. It gets redistributed at a household level and beyond the household across time and space, right? But with that comes tensions about who gets to have a claim on that, who doesn't, why, who gets to manage that. And again, we've seen this in the past with some work, and we know there's obviously some literature that speaks to that, and we're seeing it every day when we're engaged in field work on the ground. And so there's something to think about the ways in which our social protection system, and I won't even mention the gaps in our social protection system that shape the tensions that are experienced in family life, and obviously the care needs and the kind of the work in that household. So I'm going to give you an example. If you can see it, it's on slide 10. How do we make sense of what's going on? You might need to see this one to believe, not to believe it, but just to, get a, so what you see here is an orange household, right? It's a kinship diagram, a family map. The orange household, I don't know if you can see, sorry. The orange household, the orange house is a household. So everyone in that orange house is living in the same household, right? At the top, in the middle of your screen is Joyce. She's 71. She's the older person, right? Now, Joyce had a stroke. She has diabetes. She has and requires full-time care. So it's a high level of care needs. At the next level are her adult offspring, and there are 8 adult offspring. Only Zandi, one of her daughters co-resides with her. She's a nurse, and she's the primary carer for her mother, Joyce. At the third level are the kind of grandchildren, adult grandchildren, and grandchildren. 6 of the children live in the household that Joyce is living in. So before Joyce became ill, she was the primary caregiver, this is not unusual, needless to say, for 4 grandchildren, as their parents had passed away. So when Zandi took on the care of her mother, she also took on the care of the grandchildren, not her grandchildren, her children and her nieces and nephews. And so the responsibilities and the kind of the reproductive work, that is taking place in that household is increasingly, it has, it's multiple. At the top left, you see Polly. She's 35. She's a cousin. Zandi asked her cousin to come and live with her to help her care for her mother because she works. Zandi's a full-time nurse. She works 40, 50 hours a week. Now she pays Polly for this work. So now you begin to see in this image the different care activities that are illustrated, that we hear about all the time, but we actually need to see that work in respect of the older person, because they're not only limited to the older person, there are also multiple care activities. There's washing clothes, food, all sorts of washing activities, the washing of the older person when there is high care needs. There's managing finances, there's supervising homework, there's going to the shops and shopping, there's managing who gets to control the finances in terms of negotiating various needs. There's also managing the high care need of monitoring sugar levels, or and other kind of activities there. These are just some of the activities. There's attending clinics. There's supervising medication and helping older persons take medication. So there's care activities that are happening for younger persons, for older persons, but they're not necessarily being shared in this household. They are shared between 2 women, primarily. Zandi as one of the older person's offspring, and then a cousin who is paid to help with this work. So what we begin to see is, how do we make sense of this, right? And there's a second example. I'm not going to go through the second example because of time constraints. How do we make sense of this? The arguments in the paper emphasize how care happens in multiple care contexts, what we've just seen, in unequal care contexts, and it increases the inequalities between women who occupy very different class and racial positions. Now, in thinking about care and families, we might want to emphasize the obligation to care, the moral obligation of family members and community members to look after each other, Ubuntu, in a nutshell, right? Now, there is a customary law obligation and duty to care for others. And as we know, it's characterized by relationality, and interdependence shapes care in families. It also has a huge role to play in policy and legal texts, in both, put very crudely, positive ways and quite kind of harmful ways. So in previous analysis, looking at a whole bunch of legal cases that came to the courts, we could see the judiciary was using the concept of Ubuntu to remind the state to compensate for the care that took place in families, because the state was expecting families to look after their kin, right? And the judiciary played a critical role there in reminding the state, who was the RAF in that particular instance, to not overlook those obligations and to not overlook them, to see them and to compensate them as well. And it's a very particular point. So there we see Ubuntu playing a critical role in supporting care, right? And being recognized, seen, and I don't want to use the word compensated, but valued, I should say. But the use of Ubuntu and cultural assumptions about family responsibilities are also deployed in very harmful ways in the White Paper of 1997 and other policy texts, which tends to kind of use Ubuntu in ways that are talking about kind of a morally superior position of the family or the community to provide care, as some others have talked about in their work. And in particularly, it erases actually who's doing that work and the conditions under which that work is done, that reproductive work, that care work is being done, particularly in under-resourced settings. So if we were to start from an African feminist theory and think about social reproduction, what would we do? We would examine everyday practices of family care. I think the starting point would be to query, not necessarily query the concept of interdependence and obligations of care, but to see how the care practices of today have the conditions of that and what is necessary, both in terms of care needs and care responsibilities, how that has been shaped over time. So not to deny not to deny the importance of cultural obligations and the ethos of Ubuntu, by all means it exists, but to understand and investigate how it's been shaped by how it has shaped the conditions of care in families. So our starting point will be that, to look at those historical events, to look at that structuring of family care today. But it wouldn't end there. It would also be argued that the key to an African feminist approach to understanding care would be to draw attention to the ways in which women's care work is a structural part of capitalism, and women's labour has been appropriated by capitalism for many decades. You can also see how women's work is alleviating state responsibility in both the financing of care and particularly the financing of the provision of care, which is very different than providing social grants and cash support. So in more of our recent work and through the budget, we see that kind of reliance on basically women in families to carry full-time responsibilities for care work for multiple people and families alleviates, needless to say, the state of that work. And that has particular links to, thinking around who's financing care, how is it managed, but also how the care infrastructure of today has been structured, and to whom care is owed. Needless to say, we know that there's various resources that are available to some and not to others, whether it's access to hospitals, access to water, access to a wheelchair, access to a commode, access to jobs. These are all unequally distributed, as we're all aware. Now, what happens on the ground is we see this creates huge tensions. It's tensions within families, which might be familiar to us. It's also tensions in communities. These tensions are multiple. So some people are carrying an unequal load compared to their brothers, their sisters, their other family members. There's tensions in negotiation of that care arrangement. Some people don't have as much access to social protection mechanisms. So that creates tensions where some people are getting resources and others aren't. There's tensions because there are unequal access to resources. So the distribution of care work is heavily, as we know, racialized, classed, and gendered. And it's causing what's referred to as social depletion and exhaustion for those who carry out. But the tensions are also seen within a community where there are literally conflicts between home-based carers, community care workers, and social workers, blaming family members for not looking after older persons properly. Family members blaming social workers and home-based carers for not doing their jobs properly. And what underlies those tensions is the question, and they're very real. They're happening across the provinces we're working in. But what we're saying is that the state, and you can map this quite neatly, has defunded facilities, so both residential institutions, in favour of what's called aging in place, which I think we all will probably support, without any additional investment in community and home-based care and community and home-based care structures. So whilst the policy direction and the emphasis is placed on aging in place, aging in community and families, not only has there been no additional support, there's been a cutback. And this is not a COVID story. This is beyond COVID. It was happening prior to COVID. COVID made it probably easier to restrict the budgets. And that's what we see happening currently. Last slide, I can see we're getting there. So what does this mean? Well, thinking about care of older persons and going forward, first of all, challenging global policy frameworks and neo-colonial familialist policies. So what's both happening globally, whether it's the Decade for Healthy Aging or whether, whatever instrument you pick up, it's across disciplines, across what we're working on as folks in humanities. We see how these concepts are making us see things in ways that aren't aligned to what's actually happening on the ground. And that's really important. And it's happening nationally, needless to say, too. And you can see these frameworks both through the conflicts that arise in the day-to-day lives of people in communities, but also in various obvious policy texts that are kind of readily available to be analysed. So what we need to be attentive to grounded knowledge about the needs and constraints. What is a need? A need is a wheelchair that isn't broken. A need is maybe access to housing. A need is maybe even access to a residential institution because actually the older person doesn't want to be in the family home. There's too much tension. There's many needs and there's many constraints, as we all know. We sat yesterday in the Older Persons Forum for about 3 hours, listening to people's opinion or ideas about what would help. And some were so basic with no cost implications for the state. And I say basic, I mean, so you would think previously there was a time supposedly where older persons were prioritized in a queue at the SASA office or whatever, and there's so many ways in which older persons and the care of older persons can be supported that don't incur budgetary kind of issues, let's say. But we need to listen and hear what those items are. What are those ways in which the needs of older persons are being constrained? We also need to ground knowledge of how responsibilities for caring are actually practiced and how they can be supported. We need to recognise contributions that older persons continue to make and how they have been probably purposefully overlooked by the state in particular ways. And we need to provide and support the conditions under which caring relations can prosper. So we need to know what that is. More research, needless to say, and funding towards understanding family care is essential. One of the papers in the special issue points to the production of knowledge in this area. Who's funding it? Who's doing it? And where are the gaps? Where there's many gaps, but what are the silences? And why might this be the case? So that is what we have today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, there's a lot.
That's perfect. That's a lot. That's very rich, and I think for depicting and also like bringing on the table, in addition to the results of your research that you share in your paper, like a lot more about the special issue and the context also of your work. It's absolutely fascinating. I must say, as an anthropologist, my first love is kinship. And I was really taken by the way you're describing through the map, also like the choices that people make, their ability towards each other, and kind of fleshing out of the kinship that we often need. As I was reading your paper, my first question was about morality, the morality of care. And you mentioned the Ubuntu as the ideal of relationality that is our horizon of the care and caregiving, care receiving relationship. I still would want to ask you more about what is the good care? What is the good care? And in the sense of not only like efficiency but morality, how do persons as moral subjects are served best by their caregivers, and what has it to be the family, and what does it say about religions? So, like my first question would be about that. How do we associate caring for and caring about, like that quality of care? And my second question, it's a bit cheeky, but it's also serious. You discuss Ubuntu as this aspiration, but there's also, in a way, what we can say the influence of negative morality or negative moral sentiments, or such as, for example, I would describe guilt or envy or jealousy or frustration in that way. So they are related to also our positions as moral beings, but they can be experienced as negative sentiment, and they sometimes matter in those choices. I was also, as I was reading your paper, I was also thinking about my own family, my own duties, and my own anxieties around aging, my own aging, the aging of my family, etc. And I think that like that envisioning like who has to take care of the parents, etc. Or even like the gratitude that you have for your parents for taking care of the kids, but also the imagination of what's going to be in the future. All of those things are part of like a complex experience of being like either like efficient moral subject or efficient moral subjects that are like part of what it is to be related to each other and to that economy of care. So this would be my first question.
Okay, may I answer? That's quite a lot. Yeah, sure. I mean, we're often asked, speaking to your first point, what is good care, and the morality of care. So Toronto and the rest will all say, in order to know what good care is, you've got to hear from the care receivers. It's it's the connection between who's attentive to a particular need, who is not just attentive, but who's actually practically attending to the need, and then who's also responsive, who's listening to whether that need has been met properly or in a good way. And so those links between caring for and caring about and the care receivers is critical into thinking. And we see that because even in any of the community fora we hold, we listen to the caregivers, whether they're paid or unpaid, and we listen to the care receivers. And what gets raised about what is needed and what is good care. And so, from a kind of sociologist perspective, you would say, well, first of all, what is good care means what is care, right? And then that is as wide as, like, some people would see that as housing or food, but what is good care is at a familial level in particular. What we are finding is that it's the ways in which the care receivers are being understood. So that whilst they personally are feeling as a dependent, as perhaps as a burden, as a responsibility, and that they're also at the same time that transition can be quite quick, especially if there's a stroke or something particular, that there are multiple people relating to a change in events that require open conversations, open discussion. Not just about how it's managed, but how people are moving through into this experience. And what good care would be, well, we can say what it's not. It's not discharging someone after a stroke after 3 days and landing that person in a family home and saying, good luck, that's it. You can come back in 6 weeks for your next appointment. And that's what we see happening. It would be everything from working with that family, seeing what resources are in that family. And I don't mean just, whether the actual house can be accessed via a wheelchair, or whether they have the ability to look after that older person. None of those things are happening. The question of why does it have to be a particular person, was that the actual, why does it have to be a family member? So I think that was the part of it. We don't think it does. And in some households, you will see from many households, is even if there is technically a caregiver, they won't be considered a caregiver in the eyes of the care receiver. So it could be that someone is doing all the cleaning, cooking, and looking after the older person, but they don't see that person as the caregiver. They see another person who's not in the household, not actually helping, maybe not even financing the care. But for some other reason, that other person is deemed to be the caregiver. I mean, so it's not straightforward. Many people are, yes, living in households, yes, living with siblings, but there are ways in which there's a heightened level of tension taking place, where there's expectations on the sometimes younger generation, not always younger generation, to do X, Y, and Z. And that's not happening. And so, for many of the participants in our work, they would say there is no good care happening here. In relation to your second item around guilt, envy, and frustration, that is at the heart of every caregiver, particularly caregiver's experience, whether that's in the early days or throughout the course of their caregiving. That balancing of, actually, I can't do this alone. I want to do also these other things, or I don't have the capacity to do this. Why should I be doing it? Why aren't my brothers helping me? So the question around who has to take care of parents, it's sometimes not a debate and a discussion, and in those ways, I think supporting the caregiver, in addition to the older person, is necessary, because as I said, there's tensions that are taking place in this negotiation, particularly when there's not a negotiation, it's just expected of certain people, mainly women, but not only women. But it's also not to erase the ways in which others are participating. But those expressions of guilt, envy, frustration, they're happening there with the caregiver, but they're also happening with the care receiver, who do feel as a burden, who do feel, that I didn't want to do this. But there are, in these circumstances, often no other choices. There are constraints. Many older persons have expressed a desire to go to an old age home, contrary to what we all believe, that older persons don't want to go to an old age home, and contrary to probably what we would want, because many residential institutions haven't got great quality care, but it's not so much about that residential home, or it's about trying to escape this current conditions of care where there's conflict and tensions. For many, care isn't the problem. For many caregivers, caregiving for the older person, it's what's happening in the environment, whether there's drug addiction, whether there's other events taking place that are problematic, and how they're being respected or not in that regard. And that's what some of the things we're seeing.
Thank you so much. And just your answer also about like other people sometimes wanting to choose like to go to a home to be taken care of. Maybe also think that sometimes maybe what's at stake is not only the care but also how the care is producing the family and also the gender. So that there might also be a necessity for a family to be a family to take care of the of the other person, of two women to take care, to be seen as family of or a certain gender. That's not just the care that's taken, but what's connecting people. But that's what just a thinking thought, and I'm going to open it to the rest of the audience. Okay. Hi. Awesome. Okay, you might enjoy it. You can start.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elena, for presenting the project and also and I'm going to follow up on some of the questions. One has to do with the concept of Ubuntu. And increasingly, it's in this country, I've learned that there are two Mandelas. There is the world's Mandela and there is South Africa's Mandela. And that the world's Mandela is one figure, and then South Africa's Mandela is another figure. And it's something similar to the concept of Ubuntu. Because how is Ubuntu possible in a context where there are lots of individuals? Because Ubuntu is a concept that should normally operate in a space where the individuals are interdependent relations. So I always find it interesting every time we deploy the term Ubuntu in a world where we've created individuals, which operates according to a neoliberal logic. So I'm just pushing you further. Can we talk of Ubuntu in a context where we are measuring individuals, where we're talking about people's relationship with states, where we're talking about people's relationship to their own comforts, where we're talking about people as individuals rather than as people? Because I think once you have named it, then it no longer exists.
Well, you have,
once you have named it, you're giving it a form. Because where it operates, it really doesn't have a form. It's very flexible. It's like Teranga, in Senegal, or Ujamaa and lots of other spaces. So can we talk about Ubuntu in a space where it is individuals and their relationship to the state, individuals with rights and something? I would say no. That the concept of Ubuntu is a concept that has grown out of a scholarship that seeks to understand relations in the place and has become relevant as a tool to analyze the place, and that it actually doesn't operate because there is so much individual. And then when one makes such an, if that were true, then what does it mean for rereading, the data and the conclusion? The other has to do with the idea of aging itself, age and care. One is just naming care. The other, in the studies of youth, they argue that youth is it's not so much an age category. It's not so much a biological category. It's more a kind of a construct, a relational construct, which shifts or indexes different sets of relationships. And we've seen with the controversial work with Oyeronke, no, not Oyeronke, Ifi Amajiome, the invention of woman. Key argument in the invention of woman is that biology is not so important. In many African contexts, it is age and the relationship to age that's important. But age not necessarily as an age category, but as some kind of position in society. Like when I first started encountering census and they asked me, one is the head of the household, which I don't seem to understand. The second is how many members you have in your family, which also I don't seem to understand. Because if you take it as a position, it is whether for me, where I come from is whether you are a tar, and not everybody can be a tar because these are people with particular rights to perform rituals, and a sacred position, not necessarily that it's a biological space. So I'm wondering, in these spaces, apart from work, labor, which is now compartmentalized, that you have to work at a certain age, retire at a certain age, and therefore have a pension. What other value systems do people connect to that transcend? Because when you choose to go to an old people's home, you're breaking lots of other value systems, which are very important for you because where I come from, living is not so important. Living is preparing you to die. So the dying, the death, and what happens after is really key. So preparing yourself to die is so important than living itself. So when you choose to break those relations and go to an old people's home, there is so much that is happening that needs to prepare your death. So I'm just wondering how to capture all of those systems, which is measuring systems tend to to hide.
Okay, that's quite a lot. So I personally also, I agree with your first point in many ways. I don't think we can talk about Ubuntu in a way that's useful anymore. We can see practices in communities that would be characterized as Ubuntu loosely, in the sense of lots of giving, lots of support, across neighbors, across kin, all that, But the problem with it is that it's both politically and otherwise, it's in state structures and state systems, and in whether you're looking at text or whatever you're looking at, it is that it's being abused, in my opinion, and it's that yes, we can see certain forms of this working, but it's located in systems that, as you say, are built for individuals within particular categories. And when that happens, it doesn't exist. It doesn't land well, and it can't make sense. I personally, when I say personally, I don't see it as something that is able to look back and look forward and explore the kind of the political manipulation, both historically and otherwise, of care in families. And so in relation to Ubuntu itself, it's there is a flexibility with it, like you said, but at the same time, when it's being situated in contexts where the individual, it's not that the individual is necessarily, prioritized or foregrounded, but that there, a lot of systems are like that. And so like one example would be the, social protection system, where, there's grants, and so you've got a multiple mechanisms at play that are giving resources to some and not others, and are expected to be redistributed in ways that might characterize Ubuntu, but in again contexts where there's very little employment or other constraints. So I personally, in my work, and the way people talk about it is, particularly depending where you are, it's actually probably it's potentially is an ideal. It's potentially like an aspiration or something that's out there, but it's not here. And I think that maybe link where to your whole Mandela's world and South Africa's Mandela. It's like it's something that was or may have been or that is could be at one point, but it's not a reality and it's not something in my life and it's not something I can draw upon or think about or expect of others or you know. In terms of the age and care, uh, age is completely a relation. It's not a biologic position. It's yes, a position side. You ask the question of what are the other value systems at play, and one thing we see is that there is an acknowledgement between those who are giving care and those who are receiving care, i.e. that this person raised me and this person did much for me, and now it's my turn to give to them. And only for that reason I will reach a particular, I won't say position in society, but a certain kind of status or a certain personhood or a certain kind of level of understanding of who I am and who we are, but who I am in that we, that makes me want to care. Most of the caregivers never stated that they didn't want to care. Everyone, there was much support for wanting to care, wanting to give back, wanting to reciprocate, to relate to that person who was there for them in multiple ways. But it was the conditions under which that often fell that was really problematic and troubling, and the constraints of that, where there was which was problematic. Yeah. I think there was one or two other questions. Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Three more questions, so Lily, and then we'll.
Thank you, Elena, for your presentation. My question is with respect to the ethics of care scholarship. So, and I think that the ethics of care scholarship is very popular for a reason, because there's always gaps in the approaches that in the ways like been understood since the 80s. We have its own relation control, which is from the early 90s, and later there was investment, who also proposed another version of it. And now when you look at the social science scholarship, for instance, the one you're presenting on this level elderly, how feasible might it be to condense these perspectives? Is it even possible? Is it important to form a framework of executive care in South Africa or in Southern Africa? What might be the challenges of doing that, especially with respect to you can't measure and other philosophical approaches to care? And if we do frame or have a particular framework on executive care in South Africa, what might be the challenges, what might be the limitations that we should take into account?
True. So, I mean, there is, there's existing literature on this type of question, that it speaks to when we do adopt an ethics of care approach, say in the thinking about the South African context, thinking about care, thinking about families, and is that it tends to do a lot of, it tends to overlook a lot of gendered inequalities, racialized and gendered inequalities that take place on the ground, and in my thinking and in my approach to work, what I think it often not that it overlooks it, but it doesn't do necessarily that work in the same way that African feminist theory would be to have a much stronger attention to the histories of the current, let's call it the current care infrastructure, the current care arrangement. And in somewhere like South Africa, that is particularly, and in the region as well, is particularly important. Because if you're not understanding how the need for either Ubuntu or interdependence is there, then you're not really getting to understand where the inequalities, how they've accumulated and transformed and shifted and changed over time. And that's where I think, in addition to that, how it links to global supply chains, global capitalism, other forms of outside of South Africa, where what's going on that is shaping the care infrastructure here. And I think in my work, I don't think ethics of care does that work in ways that can get to those types of questions in the ways that particularly a combination of African feminist theory could, and together thinking about social reproduction theory more broadly. And I think the links to, capitalist exploitation, women's labor, the exploitation of women's labor, both in history and today, in ignoring various, forms of work and thinking, is the problematics that we see, some of which today, but also that ethics of care, doesn't do the work in the same way. I don't know if that answers your question. But I think it's a conversation. I don't think it's there is obviously the literature that talks about Ubuntu talk and do, and the ways in which the problems with that there is at one level a rhetoric that takes place of what is expected of people or what is supposed to happen, regardless of a family level or otherwise. But then there's the reality on the ground of who is actually doing this work, who is encountering those responsibilities, and that difference, that gap, is a problematic, and is something that is racialized and gendered and classed, and that where ethics of care, which doesn't ignore the kind of the hierarchies or relationality and the ways in which they shape care, but it doesn't prioritize necessarily historical shaping of that. So that's where I think combinations of African feminist theory and social reproduction theory are more aligned in getting to those questions, or better suited. I won't say aligned.
I think we are ready to go to questions. Very small. That's really very
CPOA.
My question is just about going forward in regards to recognizing contributions of what are some of the contributions?
I mean, they're multiple. So they're in the current and they're in the past. So as older persons were the linchpin of families over the last hundreds of days, I say decades, I mean literally decades, in terms of, if you want to think about it in social reproduction theory, in terms of creating a labor force, literally in the birthing process, but also supporting the labor force, being a labor force in their agricultural work and their multiple forms of work. So that's I want to say in the past, let's say, of the older persons who may not be doing that right now, even though they may be doing all of that as well right now, maybe not the birth, but and then in their current is that they are supporting families both through, maybe in South Africa at least, through an older person's grant, but also in many other ways, in care, in practical care provision, in other kind of forms of emotional support or psychological support. So there is the historical work that they've done that they've never been. It hasn't been brought into the picture in policy texts, or again in these kind of in ways that recognize that. It's not that it's been erased in the literature. It's very much in the literature. We know about it. It's not, there's no silence there, but somehow it hasn't featured. So now in the next coming years and decades, we'll hear all about pension markets. But who can have, apart from who had the ability to have a pension? I mean, and I don't mean that just in terms of formal economy workers. I'm talking about women and the roles they play. That both. So that's some of the erasures that are happening there. Is that those contributions in the past, however far back we go, it's completely insignificant. And then in the current, equally so. And so many will say that older persons, and particularly women older persons, and particularly Black lower income older persons, are covering the multiple gaps in our social protection system and our broader, in our policies that exist. So they're supporting the economy, they're supporting, families, all the rest of it. And that those in global policy frameworks, it's often about vulnerability and be dependence and a drain and I won't say a burden, but whereas in this context, both are happening at the same time. Someone can be vulnerable and be frail and be supporting in multiple ways, and that is what's happening. And the CPOA is an interesting case study. Yeah, which is shifting radically. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think I you have no regrets when you. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
We can continue maybe for a few minutes after the official end of the session. I can see on the wall that we're already past 2. So we are going to thank you very much for your time, for your responses, your contribution, and for the fascinating session. So yeah, we're very grateful.
Thanks, Dominique.
So let me announce that so we're approaching the end of this quarter and semester of seminars at FIMA, but we have again another seminar, the last one next week. We'll start transformation at universities, and on Monday we have a book lunch. About cultural longing and belonging. The extended title of the book is on our website. And also next Wednesday, I think we also have an African epistemic seminar online, strictly online. So in general, all of our seminars are in person and online when we have no to do. But this one in particular is not. So thank you so much, and see you.
Thanks.